with voxels, everything is discrete. If you could do collision detection on a voxel grid, that wouldn't need to be convex. And getting physics to work with online multiplayer is really hard. It's really hard to sell middleware to game developers. You're not solving a problem. Like, everyone saw the success of the graphics accelerator, and Ageia had this idea, like, we want to do the same thing, but for physics. So the problem with slicing things is that you have floating point precision. Unless you are very careful, you can end up with like not well-defined geometry. Like, we did an escape room, like a physical game experience. We had this panel where you sat down, a control panel, and then we had a hole in it, and behind that hole we had a TV, a large TV, so you could peek into the actual reactor hall.
Financially profitable?
Not at all. It was terrible.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Wookash Podcast. This time I'm joined by Dennis Gustafsson, an engineer working on physics engines and physics-based games from scratch, and author of the mobile games Sprinkle and Smash Hit, among others, as well as PC game Teardown. Dennis taught me a lot during this conversation. I highly recommend to watch it. Tell me, how did you get into physics?
So physics, I never been that particularly interested in physics, like academic physics. And I generally don't see a strong correlation between that kind of physics and the physics we do in games. So I guess when I started get interested in game physics was at university. I had a lot of student friends who was very interested in graphics. Everyone was interested in rendering. But I found the motion of objects more interesting. This was in the 90s. So there wasn't a whole lot of simulation in games at that time. And I remember this game, Carmageddon 2, that had very accurate simulation. And that is, I think, something that really sparked my interest. Not that I really enjoyed the game, but I was studying the physics. I was very fascinated that you could like stack objects and they behaved like in the real world, and that was, to me, that was very exciting.
Okay.
And then that's just when it started.
Okay. And you were doing this during the university, and then you stayed in the university doing the research?
Yeah, it was just throughout different courses and classes at university. I tended to focus on physics. So if we had like this was media technology, a master's program. So we actually had a lot of classes about 3D graphics, and we actually also had one on simulation. And whenever I got a chance, I just did something simulation. Even if it was a rendering class, I did something simulated it, and then also rendered it just to squeeze it in. So there was a lot of that during university. And then at the final semester, when we did this master's thesis, I teamed up with another student, and we made our own rigid body simulator.
Nice.
That's thesis.
How much work was it?
That was 6 months. I'd been doing a bunch of work before that, but it was a pretty good amount of time, I think. Full time, 6 months. It was not a great simulator, but so that also sparked the beginning of this company that we formed afterwards.
Yeah. Rigid body. I think we should paint a picture for everybody who is listening. There will be people that are listening that have computer programming experience, but not necessarily physics related. Can you do a bit of an overview? What would be the rigid body and what would be the simulation? And we can even go further into like, what is a physics engine? What's it doing?
So nowadays it's a bit more complex, but back then in the 90s, if a game had any type of simulation, it was only rigid body. And rigid body physics is basically what it sounds like. Everything is rigid, so there's nothing flexing, there's no cloth, there's no deformable, there's no water or smoke or anything. Whatever you simulate is just something that is a rigid object colliding and resting on top of other rigid bodies. They can also usually be connected by joints. So you can have two things connected by a hinge joint or a ball joint and things like that. And not long afterwards, people started using this, of course, to connect limbs of a character, and then you could have, and that's how the ragdoll physics was formed. But yeah, that's basically what rigid body physics is. It's still the dominant, when people talk about physics in games, it's still rigid body physics they usually mean, even though now we have a very advanced simulation of cloth, fluids, smoke, deformables in games.
Okay, we'll get to that based on your projects. So you finished the university and you formed a Mekon research.
Mekon Research was the name, and it started around this thesis that we did at university, but I don't think any of that code really survived that long into that project. We rewrote all of it. The simulator we did at university was more academic. It was more like a mathematical linear equation solver that solved things very accurately. It has the advantage of giving very nice results if you feed it good input. But it also has the downside that if you feed it not so nice input, it tends to just explode and everything flies all over the place. It's also not very fast. The performance is very unpredictable. So if you have like 10 bodies, it works fine. If you had like 100 or 1,000 bodies, the scale of performance tends to not scale so well with the number of contacts. So it's kind of like a quadratic scale of the thing, and it's just not acceptable for games. So we had to come up with something else, and that's when we also discovered these iterative methods for solving these equations. So we started using that, and that's still what people are using, I would say, for rigid body physics.
Okay. Maybe we can also paint a picture. So I learned when I was doing this physics simulations that the issue is when you're doing the simulation, you can have an error in your computations. And because you're doing this like frame by frame, these errors can compound. So the stability of the simulation is quite important, right? Because you need to think about it like in a long spans of time. And there are two large categories, right? There's a physics simulation that wants to be like super accurate, but time is not constrained. And there's the game physics where you are very constrained about the time and you don't want to just compute, let's say, a couple of seconds and you have, let's say, 1 day to do it. You need to compute it now in like a frame because you need to render it immediately, right?
Yeah.
So these are I think, at least in my mind, there are two like separate categories. Is this correct, more or less?
Yeah, I think what's happening now and has been going on for a while is that these two are kind of merging.
Okay.
That the methods we're using in games and have been using in games are approaching the more academic or like the research oriented simulation, because they usually give the same result. So if you just decrease the time step, you can actually get the same result, and it's always nice when things go fast. So sometimes you could even get better accuracy with these in the same amount of computation. You can actually get really nice results with these simpler iterative methods if you just lower the time step enough to make it more, to improve the accuracy. So they're not like two different worlds. It's actually closer than you might think.
Okay. Can we spend a bit of time before we go into like what Mekon did and then further to talk about time steps, fixed time step versus non-fixed, and then when you say iterative methods, what do you mean by that exactly? So to paint the picture.
Sure. So physics for games, it usually, well, always I would say solved in time steps. And say you have like a 60 hertz update of the screen, you can tick the physics also at 60 hertz, or you can tick it faster or slower. It's a little different depending on the game, but you always do it in discrete steps. And for most simulators, it's pretty important to keep this time step fixed so that you always take the same amount of time forward every frame. And the frame rate is not always fixed in the game, of course. So that can cause some trouble because you want to keep the physics at a fixed rate, but not necessarily the rendering. So that's when you're going to have to start interpolating the result. And these are not really tied to the iterative solver. So you take the physics at one rate, and then maybe we should break down the physics, what the physics engine does to understand the iterative solver. So usually in the physics engine, you have a couple of different phases, where the first one is to do collision detection. The most complicated part in the physics engine is usually the contacts when things collide. The joints are sort of easier. They're always the same in between two bodies. But for the contacts, we need to first find what are all the overlapping or potentially overlapping objects. So that is done. Usually you have like a bounding box around each object, and then you find overlaps between these bounding boxes. It's called a broad face collision detection. Then you get a list of pairs, and then you go through over these pairs, and you do a more detailed thing where you find not only the point where they overlap or the closest point, but actually a number of points. That in most physics engines, these form a convex patch between these objects. So this is what you send to the solver. And then the solver figures out the next dynamic state of the simulation. So the input to the solver is like, where are all the objects? What are their velocities, their mass properties, and stuff like that. And then you also send these contact patches or contact points. And then it figures out how things can move, because if you don't have any constraints, bodies just tend to move the way they moved. But if you introduce these contacts, you can say, okay, it wants to move like this, but there's a contact in between, so it has to respond to that in somehow. And this may sound pretty complicated, and if you formulate this mathematically, it is pretty complicated, because it's not just a system of linear equations, because it actually also has the property that a contact can only push on objects. It cannot pull. So it's not like a linear thing where you just compute this value, but you also have the constraint that it has to be positive. It can only push things apart. But it's actually not that complicated using an iterative method. So instead of seeing this as this big mathematical problem, it's called a linear complementarity problem. Instead of doing that and solving it mathematically, what we do, we just go around at every contact, push it a little bit, like solve every contact separately. And if we do this over and over and over again, we actually end up with a thing that converges towards the correct state. But it can take a number of iterations to do this. And that is basically the method of solving this iteratively. And the implementation is also much simpler than doing the mathematically correct thing.
Okay.
So you just basically just a loop over contacts, solve each contact as if that was the only contact, and then you just move on to the next.
Yeah. So instead of looking at all of the objects at once and figuring out where each one would be, you localize this and you look at, okay, here's one contact point. These are the objects that are touching, how they should go away, and then you solve them one by one. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Regarding the time step, I think I've heard it that you can have a stable simulation with a variable time step. Is this correct? But it's not common.
It's not common, and it's even though you can get there, it's very few people are doing it, because the reason is that if you give it well-formed input, that can certainly work. But if you normally this iterative method of solving it, you go over these contacts and other constraints a number of times, and usually you could solve it until every constraint is satisfied, but that's going to take a long time. So what you do is you typically cap that at the number of iterations. In many games, it could be like 4, 6, 8 iterations. And then you just say, okay, enough. There's going to be a small error. We'll fix it next frame. So you get these errors that you then compensate for the next frame. And this error is also going to scale by the time step. So the error you got from, say, the previous frames or the accumulation of all the previous frames, you then want to fix afterwards. And if you get varying time steps, that's going to over or under compensate depending on whether the current time step is longer or shorter than the average of the previous ones. So you can get into these shaking and self-oscillation and things like that.
Okay.
There are ways to try and compensate for this, but it's never going to be perfect because if you vary the time step a lot between every frame, that's really hard to work with.
Okay. So basically, by having a fixed time step, you also are locking the error to some sort of like order of magnitude, like a size, and then you can reason about what was the error in a much easier way than if you had the variable one.
Yeah, you're not really locking the error or clamping the error to a certain range. It's more that if you had an error from a previous frame and you want to fix it in the next, you typically want to know, in order to reason about how to fix it in a certain amount of time, or give, you can almost see this as like a spring. Say you have two objects and they collide and there's a contact in between them, but the solver doesn't manage to fully resolve that. They're going to still move towards each other a little bit, ending up in penetration. And then that you want to fix that amount of penetration, and you can only do that. You can see that as kind of a spring damper. So you have like a little spring trying to push it out.
Yeah. Okay.
And reasoning about how stiff that spring should be to make it look nice and smooth is really hard if you don't know the time step.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So with this as a foundation, now Mekon research. What was the idea for the institute? Was this like research institute, or was this like a company?
Research was just a part of the name. It was just a company.
Okay. So what was the company goal? What was the product? What was the vision?
Yeah, so we had like the Mekon SDK was just it was a physics engine that was the intention to just plug it into the game engine. You feed it your objects, it takes care of the calculations of the physics, and then you can get the result back, just like what you have today with PhysX or Bullet or Havoc or something like that. When this came out, physics was not widely used in games. So this was kind of a new thing. We had a couple of competitors. One was Math Engine.
Okay.
I don't know if anyone remembers that. And then there was Havoc. That was pretty new at the time. There also after a couple of years they've been running. There was also a new one called Novadex that started to show up, which later became PhysX. But physics engines was a pretty new thing back then. So I think we were a little bit naive to think that we could just come right out of university and make a product and have people be excited. It's really hard to sell middleware to game developers if you're not solving a problem. Like this is something I thought a lot about. Like if you want to sell new technology as middleware to a studio, that's a really tough sell. Like they're there with their games, there are deadlines, and there comes some other guy. Hey, wait, maybe you want to add all these bunch of features with all their problems, and it's a hard sell. And since physics wasn't usually planned in games, we tried to sell them a problem rather than a solution, which is hard. So the company didn't do that well. I must say it was tough.
Okay.
It was a little early for physics engines, I think.
How does the situation change over time? Now it's like you have a Unity and Unreal, and Unity uses now PhysX for the majority, but for 2D uses Box 2D. And now with the new dot stack, I recently talked to Aras from Unity, and he explained that there are actually 4 engines in use, like in terms of physics. It's like how does this market look like now? Is this like everything locked as far as you could tell? Like you have 2 big engines. They use this.
I don't follow it really closely, actually, since I always built my own engines. I'm not a user of Unity or Unreal, so I can't really say. I know it's pretty complicated these days. Yeah, I can't really say anything about it because I haven't used that part. I also know some people writing their own physics engines for using in Unreal. So it's yeah, it's a little complicated. One would have thought that it would have stabilized by now, but it's almost the opposite. It's getting more and more complex.
So for the Mekon research, you were developing the physics engine and trying to sell it to game studios, right?
Yeah.
For how many years?
We started 2001, I think, and we ran it for 4 years, I think. We did get a couple of clients. It was the only big one was Duke Nukem Forever that we signed in, was it 2004 maybe? And that was a good one because it went on forever, and then it was a highly anticipated game at the time, so we could use that as like an exciting customer for a long time. But other than that, there were a few smaller games using it. We had some venture capital. The company never did well financially, I would say. And then eventually we got acquired by this American company, Ageia, in that was in 2005. Yeah.
Ageia?
Ageia. That was, yeah, no one remembers that. They did the physics hardware accelerator. Some people remember that. It was back in, it was 20 years ago. Everyone saw the success of the graphics accelerator, and Ageia had this idea, like, we want to do the same thing, but for physics. So you buy an extra hardware, plug it into your PC, you get awesome physics. That didn't really work out. No one has a physics accelerator nowadays. So they bought Novadex, this company in Switzerland that was a competitor to us. And then just a year later, I think they also bought Mekon, and we tried to incorporate some of our stuff into into that, even though most of it was actually Novodex's stuff. But that's kind of where the Mekon journey ended. So we got sucked up into the Ageia and trying to do hardware physics together with the guys in Switzerland.
Okay. This is where this is when you were flying to Zurich.
Yes, I was flying back and forth Sweden and Switzerland for a while, and it was a very rewarding thing because there was so many smart people there. It was fantastic. Most of them are still on the physics team, actually. 20 years later.
That's a great sign. That's a great sign.
Yeah. So 2005, I don't know when Ageia eventually got bought out by NVIDIA. I think it was maybe in 2008 or 9 or something like that.
Okay.
And then this office in Zurich got turned into an NVIDIA office for doing the physics SDK, or continuing the work on the physics SDK. But instead of doing it on a dedicated hardware, you do it as part of on the GPU instead.
Yeah.
And I think the whole idea with a separate accelerator card for physics, it wasn't that great to begin with, because a GPU, I don't think they maybe anticipated the way GPUs were going towards more general compute. Because the physics accelerator was basically also just, it's all just a number cruncher, like different cores operating with their local memories, and then GPUs going also exactly that direction. It was kind of merging. There was also a lot of problems with Ageia and physics, and this thing I talked about solving a problem, it was even bigger when trying to do hardware physics. Like, imagine coming to a game studio on a timeline and asking them to do extra content and extra features for these very, very few people that actually buys this hardware.
And then
we had to pay them, of course, to do that, but it was very messy, and it's and then I learned a lot about making products from that. Like, don't try to make a problem. Try to make something that solves a problem instead.
Then imagine Game Studio, like, not only you sell them this issue, but they also need to go to their customers, the gamers, and tell them, guys, you should really buy additional piece of hardware to run our game. It's like,
and of course no one could require that, so they had to make the game fully playable without the physics accelerator. But there were many other problems also with Ageia, like the amount of speed up that you actually got wasn't, it didn't really motivate buying extra hard. And this was also around the time where PCs started to get extra cores. Up until now, everything was single core PC, but around that time, these dual core machines started showing up. And then instead of running physics on a PPU, like the physics processing unit, you could just running it on a separate core, and that was fine. So it was a lot of bad timing, and I don't know.
Can we talk a little bit about how hardware is used in terms of CPU, GPU? How much of the physics engine work can you do multi-threaded? I know that some of your recent work was in this area, but so that, like, because I heard about this PPU idea, and it was that it was in the past. But generally speaking, now we have CPUs and GPUs, and CPUs can do a lot of work that is fast, but they have a couple of cores, and we have GPU that are highly parallelizable for things like matrix multiplication. And how does the physics computation fits in this mindset?
So I think what most people do, and what I always do also, is to run the physics only on the CPU. You can run. There's some things that could work well on a GPU, like particles, for instance. If you want to do smoke or fluid simulation, that could work. But for rigid body physics in particular, it's not very well suited for the GPU. Not from a technical perspective, or like a hardware perspective. It runs fine on a GPU, and that there are people who have done that. But from a gameplay and game engine perspective, having the physics run on the GPU is not usually not a great idea, because you want the result of the physics. The gameplay usually depend a lot on the output from the physics. So you do want the result immediately. And usually when you do something on the GPU, I mean, you can synchronize buffers and send it, but the GPU is never in sync with the CPU, or it could be, but it's usually a bad idea because of all these stalls. So if you want to do physics on the GPU, you kind of have to push gameplay to the GPU also, because you simulate a bunch of bodies, you see these two overlap or these two are close to each other, and you want to do a rate cast here and there, and then you want to take that result and maybe spawn an enemy or something. Or in my case, in Teardown, two things collide and there's a strong enough force, I want to split up the objects, create new objects, and blah blah blah. And it's awfully complicated to do all that on the GPU. So since you have to put gameplay code on the CPU, it's just not really an option to do the physics on the GPU. And there are some parts of the physics pipeline, like we talked about before, this broad phase collision detection for checking overlapping pairs that can be very efficiently implemented on the GPU. Also the near phase, which is 100% parallelizable to check these pairs and generate lists of contact points or patches. Also very well suited for parallelization at a massive scale. The solver is harder, because when you it actually typically does not parallelize well at all. Not the method. There are actually two ways to do it. One is called Gauss-Seidel, which is the one I described earlier. You just solve each contact separately, and then after solving the first one, you have adjusted the velocities of those two bodies, and then you solve the second one, taking into account the result of the first one. So it's kind of a serial operation to solve them one by one. There is one called Jacobi, in which you solve all of them independently, and then try to work out the result afterwards, which also works, but it converges much, much slower. So you need a lot more iterations, and usually, at least on the CPU, it's not worth it to do it in parallel, because you need to do so many more iterations for it to converge. But there are ways to go around it. There are two. Well, one classical way when talking about parallelizing the solver, and that is to break it up into simulation islands. So you have a ragdoll over here with, say, I don't know, 12, 15 joints. And then you have a ragdoll 20 meters over there simulating bouncing off the ground. Those two never touch each other or interact with each other. So you could solve them on different threads. And it's going to be fine, because they never change the same body, so to speak. And people have been doing that for a long time. That's also what we do in Teardown. The problem, of course, especially in Teardown, I would say, is that it tends to be large piles of rubble. and these large piles are going to end up in the same simulation island. So there's not a whole lot to break up. And that's what I've been focusing on very recently. And it's not an invention of mine. It's people have been doing this for a few years now, where they try to break up, have a large pile of rubble, lots of contacts. There are ways to classify or break this problem up into different passes. So if you imagine you have 10 objects resting in a pile, you can find pairs of objects, which is fine to solve in parallel.
Yeah.
But then you're going to have to do another pass to tie together the ones that didn't fit in the first pass. So you can imagine in a large pile, you're going to end up with a lot of these passes to cover all of it. And you're also going to mess a little bit with the order in which they're solved, which can also have problems. But that it's called graph coloring, this problem of trying to break up this. You can see it as a contact graph where the contact points are kind of links between these nodes, which are the bodies, and then you're trying to colorize the things that can be solved in parallel. So that's what I've been doing for the new project.
Okay, this is very specific in terms of using this as a general purpose mechanism by default in a physics engine, in game engine like Unity. It's very difficult to probably justify the complexity to use just for any physics.
You would need to implement the physics engine, I think, for that to make any sense. You can't really modify an existing physics engine to use this unless you replace the whole solver. And it's unfortunately it's a pretty complicated thing. It was more complicated than I was hoping to implement that and get it efficient. And that ties into just multi-threading and how to synchronize threads, because as you can imagine, if you break up this pile into a number of passes, typically that number of passes ends up being maybe around 10, 12, depending a little bit on the configuration, but usually 10 to 12, 15 maybe. And then you have so all the threads in the machine, you tell them, now solve all the bodies in this pass. And then you kind of want to synchronize. And then you say, for the next pass, go solve all these bodies. And then you do that like 10 times in just per iteration. So if you want to solve all the bodies 8 times, you're going to have like 80 to 100 synchronization points. And you want to do that in like a millisecond. And CPUs and operative systems are not really designed to synchronize that much across threads. You cannot use mutices and these regular synchronization primitives. You have to rely on lockless programming and atomics to do it at that granular level.
Okay. All right. We're gonna go back to the story. From Mekon, you start another company and you call it Mediocre Games. Which I would say is underselling your games from the get-go.
That started a little bit as a joke. We didn't know what to call it, and we were kind of there were a lot of, especially in the mobile space, there were a lot of studios having bombastic names and deliver kind of mediocre experiences, and we wanted to do the opposite, so we just named it Mediocre. I thought it was funny, and a lot of journalists also thought it was fun. They always made like a little pun or a joke about the name, so it kind of worked out, I think.
Yeah, I would be scared as a journalist to say like mediocre games without any pun. Because you would be like, why are you so offensive? You're covering a game and they're saying mediocre like from the get-go.
Yeah, I think most people understood or got the joke. Some people didn't, but the only time we really had a problem with that was, I think, in the App Store. We didn't think about this before releasing the game, but at least at the time, the company name was displayed together with the title of the game next to the rating in a way that made it look like, here's Sprinkle, mediocre. And then you saw like reviews and it didn't look very well, but yeah.
Okay. Now, how these problems, physics problems, map to the mobile world with much more constrained resources? Because
Yeah.
mediocre games were mobile games, right?
Yeah. It was, I started that together with an old friend, Henrik Johansson. We used to make games as teenagers, so we went way back, and we wanted to make an actual game together, because up until this point I had only been doing game technology. I had not been doing any games, and he was working as an art director, so we complemented each other really well. So he did all on the art side, I did all the programming. And it was the release of the iPad that sparked this idea. Um, it was 2010, I think, it came out. I was, up until that point, I had not been that excited about mobile gaming. I thought it was ridiculous to do on such a small screen and blah and all this. So, but the iPad was something different. It had like a large screen, nice form factor, good touch, actually touch interface that worked. So we wanted to do something about it, and I had been doing this. I'd been starting a new physics engine the previous year, where I tried to combine fluid mechanics, soft bodies, and rigid bodies into the same solver, so have this kind of universal solver idea, and a much more lower level physics engine where you could pick and choose and build like building blocks for a physics engine, so to speak. And one part of that was trying to solve fluid dynamics in a way that resembles the way you do rigid body physics very much. So it's also using a Gauss-Seidel iterative solver, but you have to formulate the constraint very differently for that to work with fluid dynamics. So I had this fluid simulator, and I just tried to rewrite that into 2D and see what I could do on the iPad with that. And it's not a strong processor, but it's actually not that bad either.
Okay.
It was faster than I thought it would be. You couldn't have a large amount of. I think in Sprinkle we ended up having something like around 1,000 particles maximum.
Okay.
On the screen at the same time. It was problematic. The first, we didn't really have a gameplay idea. We just had like some amount of fluid. And in the beginning, we also used the tilt sensor, so you could like push fluid around a maze by using the tilt sensor. It was at that time where mobile games could still be kind of gimmicky and get away with it. But the amount of fluid, I think, was a little bit problematic when you didn't dynamically change. If you just had that amount of fluid, it didn't look like very much. So it took a couple of iterations until we finally realized that, yeah, we have to give each particle a lifetime. So you could continuously spray or pour out fluid, and then they evaporate over time. That gives the sense of having much more fluid than you actually have. And that's when it really started working.
Okay. Yeah, you said 1,000. I was like, I thought it's like order of magnitude more. Because you
Oh,
see
really?
that's
No.
like,
Yeah, we tried to do some tricks when rendering them. We render them with little 2D sprites, but they're actually elliptical, so we kind of orient them around the direction of the edge of the fluid to make it smoother and things like that. And we also adjust the size of the particle based on the density, and there's a lot going on in that, in between the simulation and the visualization, to give the illusion of having more particles.
can we do a bit of a overview for the fluid simulation in general, how to think of it, how it's done under the hood. Because to me, this was like one of this magical things. It's like you can see the fluid, and then like
Mhm.
how on earth somebody figures out like what is happening from frame to frame. I didn't have a conceptual model of what's happening under the hood, and I guess a lot of listeners don't have it as well. So how to think of fluid simulation, how it's done under the hood.
Right. So fluid simulations can be done in one of two different ways. Well, actually, now there are a couple more, but there are two main categories of making fluid. One is doing it particle-based, which is what we did in Sprinkle. The other one is grid-based, where you have like a fixed grids with fixed size cells, and then you just compute how much fluid or how much density there is in each grid cell. And you've probably seen there are a lot of online demos with these. You can drag your mouse and they're going to get these vortices, and that's usually the grid-based one. Whereas if you do the particle-based one, it's usually a better fit for games, since the grid-based is very constrained. You can only have fluid in this box that you define, and it's pretty complicated to make that dynamic. So if you want to have a whole world and you want to have fluid at different places, you're going to have to dynamically allocate and deallocate these grid chunks and have the fluid transparently move from one chunk to the next and stuff like that. Whereas with particles, you just have particle positions and they can be anywhere. So in a larger game level, for instance, particles are nicer to work with. The problem with particles is that in order to update the motion of the particles, you need to know which other particles are close.
Yeah.
So if you want to update one particle, you need to know what are the neighbors of this particle. And in a grid, that's really easy because you just look like left, right, up, down, and then you got it. With particles, you're going to have to do something. You can't just go through all the particles for every particle. That's like an n-squared problem. So you put them in some kind of acceleration structure. You can put them in a hash grid or a dynamic bounding volume tree or something to accelerate that query, like what other particles are close to me. And that's usually where the majority, or close to the majority at least, of the time is spent in these particle-based methods, because the actual calculations are usually quite simple. It's very similar, well, at least in my case with Sprinkle, it's very similar to how it's done in rigid body, because that was the intention of the whole implementation. So it's also solved using a Gauss-Seidel solver, but instead of solving at contact points, you solve for pressure or for density at each particle. So it's these. If you look at these fluid equations, usually hard to read, and I also don't fully understand them. But you can do a lot of tricks. As always with game physics, you don't really need to understand actual physics to do something that looks nice, and that's true for fluids as well. If you just do something very intuitive, like if there is a lot of particle, if you have a particle here, and then you have a lot of particles on the right side, it's kind of obvious that the pressure is going to push that to the left, right? So you can formulate this problem, and you can take parts of that fluid equation, like this means that the pressure gradient has to be how to compute that in relation to the neighbors, and you plug that in, and maybe you don't care about viscosity or something, and it looks kind of nice anyways. So it's it's a lot of just simplifications.
Yeah. So this particle approach you simulate it with like for let's say like a small dots, and these dots have a lot of properties. And then after you have your simulation done and you know where are the particles being pushed, for example, you do the nice rendering and it looks like water. And I was like, oh, it's fine, it's water. But underneath, you simulate this with pretty much with particles. And for the other category, you need to have a grid and you kind of look where, as heat, for example, right? As heat, where heat spreads from a point that is very hot towards the neighbors and dissolves all around the grid. This would be
Right.
the core ideas. When you said there are new ones, how the new ones
Yeah.
look
So
like?
there's one I'm particularly fascinated by that that kind of combines the two. It's called particle in cell methods, and there are different variants of that. A few years ago, I implemented one called affine particle in cell, or APIC, and um, you basically take all the you simulate the fluid as if it was particles. So you each particle defines an amount of fluid or smoke, depending on the calculations are actually the same for fluid or smoke. It's just using the same equations. So you have this amount of fluid, and then instead of finding the neighbors, when you compute the dynamics for that, you splat that into a grid. And then you do the dynamics calculations on the grid. And then you kind of sample back the result from the grid into the particle. So you go back and forth between the grid and the particle representation every frame. And it sounds maybe more complicated than it is, but it has this property of, if you squeeze a lot of the problem with the classical problem with particle-based approaches is that since you have these neighbors, if you squeeze a lot of fluid or smoke into this small confined area, there's going to be like hundreds of neighbors for every particle, and it's just going to be very hard to work with, like a very slow, because everyone is neighbor with everyone else. If you do it like this, is that you just splat all of them into that grid, and then you solve the dynamics just on these very few grid cells, and then you can sample back the velocity at which they move, and then just move them. So it's actually more or less constant in time, no matter the density of the particles, which is a super nice property when you simulate.
When you say constant in time, I didn't get that.
Well, maybe not constant, but if you have, well, actually sort of, because if you squeeze, well, more like linear in total time, but for the dynamics solver, it's actually pretty much constant, no matter how many particles are in those grid cells. So say you
Okay.
have a number of grid cells, and then if you have just one particle moving about in that area, or 10,000, you just solve the
Yeah.
same numbers. And then, of course, you're going to have to sample back all those velocities, and that's going to be more linear in time. But for the dynamics update, is not really dependent on the density of particles in an area, which is nice.
Okay. So we started with the discussion about fluid simulation based on the game Sprinkle. And then a game that I loved actually and played like 10 years ago, Smash Hit, came out. And it was all about breaking stuff. And by the way, the
Yes.
core idea, I think, of the game is brilliant. Like it's perfectly designed for mobile. You just tap the
Yes.
screen, and there's no limit to how much tap you can do, because now a lot of games are like limited. It's like, oh, you've made like 5 things, now you need to wait 2 hours. It's like, and then you just spam the balls, and then you need to go through, like, you follow a sort of a path, like a trajectory, and you need to smash things that are on the screen made out of glass, sort of, and form a path for your camera to smoothly go in. And a lot from the physics standpoint, the main core thing is that like it's all simulated nicely, and you need to actually properly break the glass, right? You have this, for example, rectangular thing, and if you press the tap on the screen, there is a ball going in and then breaks the glass. And depending on where it hits, it breaks like physically accurately. So how what was the development of the game, how it was received, what was the reception, and then we can dive in a bit more into this teardown like smashing things.
Sure. So Smash Hit was, I think, our third or fourth game at Mediocre. We already had some success with Sprinkle, but I think the idea for Smash Hit, that gave us some time to actually develop, like some leeway to do something spectacular. And the idea for Smash it came from partly from Mekon, actually, because we did a lot of, when we make a physics engine, you make a lot of these physics demos.
Okay.
And in many cases, these physics demos, I think, was more fun than the actual games that we used. Like, just playing around with physics is fun, right? And we had one demo in particular where you were in this museum and you could just throw balls at different things, and they broke. It was very simple breakage, but it still worked, and it was fun. And I thought, why not just make a game totally based around that? And then Henrik did an amazing job with his abstract visuals, and we had musician Douglas who made a soundtrack for that. That was also really nice. But yeah, that fascination of breaking things had been there for a long time. So there was just like a channel to get that in the game format. And the reception was amazing. It was by far our most popular game. And I think even by today's standard, 10 years later, Smash It did really well in terms of downloads. It was, I think the first day it got like 2 million downloads,
Nice.
which is, even by today's standard, I think is pretty good. We had, it was a free game. That was also our first game with this. That was not like an upfront payment. It was more like an try before you buy type monetization. We didn't really want to do like classical this thing with consumables in the game and stuff. So we just had like a one big unlock that you could pay. I think it was $2, and you got the whole game. So it didn't monetize spectacularly, but since we had so many downloads, it's still made very well financially. But it was a very, very small fraction, because we also were pretty generous with how you could play the game without paying. So if you didn't pay and you lost, you had to start over all the way from the beginning. Whereas if you did pay, the only thing you actually got was the ability to start from a checkpoint. And I even heard some people who thought that was cheating, so they didn't want to pay. But yeah, So the breakage in that game was procedural. That's it. So when you hit something, I tried to break the object up based on the point of impact, and it's very simple. It just slices the object with planes. It's all the objects in Teardown are convex, and if you slice a convex object with a plane, you get two convex objects. Then you can just keep going, and everything will be guaranteed to be convex. The problem with slicing things is that you have floating point precision, and unless you are very careful, you can end up with like non like ill defined or like not well defined geometry, like vertices, things that are not fully connected, or degenerate triangles and things like that. So I had to spend a lot of time to implement this in a very careful way to make sure that that never happened. Yeah, breaking things with triangles is not very nice. It has a lot of problems.
How do you select planes to
The planes, I think, are just based on the I don't remember, but I think they were based on the velocity of the incoming thing
ball?
that broke them. So if yeah, I think the plane is aligned with the velocity of the ball when you throw it, so it kind of breaks, and then you have a number of randomized planes which all align with that velocity, and then.
Okay.
But I honestly don't remember. It was too long ago. It's basically just a bunch of randomized planes.
Okay. Okay.
But the problem with that is also if you break a convex object, because we didn't talk about this, but in physics, the near phase collision detection, the one you do after the bounding boxes, the one that generates the contact, that is almost always done on convex objects because there are a lot of simplifications you can do to this problem. If both objects are convex, there are a class of algorithms you can use for detecting overlap and also for extracting the contact points that's so much simpler when everything is convex. So, and when you break things, unfortunately, if you make a hole in something, which is usually what happens when you break something,
Yeah.
that's not going to be convex anymore. So you're going to
Yeah.
have to, that's why I split with planes in Smash It. Because if you
Ah.
slice something with a plane, you're guaranteed that the two parts will always be convex. But the problem is that you now have two objects, and then if you slice, so if you want to make another slice, you're going to have to slice both of those two into two new ones, and you have four.
Yeah.
And then you do it one more time, and then you have eight. And it's
Yeah.
just gonna it just blows up in the number of shapes after a while. So if you want to continuously break stuff using this method, it's going to be very slow and a lot of a lot of objects. So yeah.
Yeah, and then you allowed the player to spam and just throw a lot of balls. So
Yeah.
it can actually quickly go up with the splitting phase, right? Like
Yeah. So I think in Smash It, there is a limit. If something is small, if a shape is small enough, it's not split again.
okay.
Just to prevent things from being like smaller and smaller and smaller and just more
Okay.
and more and more shapes. So there is a limit to it. And I don't think that was particularly problematic because since you always move forward, you don't really have that much of a chance to go up to an object and try to abuse it, like split it over and over again. But in a different game, that method would never have worked. There would have needed to be something pretty different, I think.
Okay. Okay, let's turn to by the way, to finish off, to have a company called Mediocre Games and then to make a game called Smash It. It's such a fun
Yeah.
dichotomy.
Yeah, it was. I don't remember how the name came about. We always wanted the name to have this like dual meaning a little
Yeah.
bit. You smash things and you hit things, so it's yeah, you kind of get the idea. And it was the mediocre Smash Hits is kind of a nice combination.
Then, after a period of making mobile games, you formed a new company, Tuxedo Labs, right?
Mhm.
And started work on Teardown. Can you tell me a little bit about the transition, why it wasn't done as mediocre games, what happened, and then we'll move to the Teardown world.
Right. So when we started Mediocre, the intention was always to make just a few games and then stop. We had no ambition to build a studio around it. And for the most part, it was only the two of us, Henrik and I, who ran Mediocre. There was actually one more person joining, Emil, for the last two games as a contractor, and we worked with a few other contractors for level design and stuff like that. But the idea was always to make a few games and then do something else. We had we never had like a proper office or employees or anything. And we also saw that the mobile space was getting. We didn't really like the way things were headed with this free to play and it's like slot machines. Game design was so. It was almost the same as monetization. Like if you didn't design your game for monetization, you couldn't make any money, and that's just not a very nice environment to make games in, I think. So we both wanted to get away from that. So after our final game, Pinout, we just said that's it, and we we decided to do something else. Henrik wanted to go off and make more like artsy games, driven by his passion. So he started working on a PC game called Overlook Trail that has been in development since then.
Oh, wow.
It's actually coming out very soon. It's
Nice.
going to be released very soon. But yeah, he's been working on that for a long, long time. And I didn't really know. I didn't really have a plan. I just started experimenting with technology. Actually, I did do another thing in between, together with Emil, the contractor, Mediocre. We did an escape room, like a physical game experience, which was super fun. I was fascinated by escape rooms. I was also fascinated by how bad game design usually is in escape rooms. It's usually just a bunch of codes, and you, it's overall it's usually pretty terrible from a design perspective. Escape rooms, I think.
Is it still in
So we wanted
operation? The escape room?
no, well, actually, it exists. It was operational in Malmö, in Sweden, for a few years, but then they changed owner, and now it's just collecting dust at like a co-working space. Someone maybe plays it now. I don't know actually.
Okay.
But it was we designed it more as a video game, but in physical form. So we built like a control room to a fictional nuclear power plant that you played together with a friend. So it was a 2-player game where you had. So we were soldering a lot of buttons and meters, and we had like a TV. We had this panel where you sat down, a control panel, and then we had a hole in it, and behind that hole we had a TV, a large TV, so you could peek into the actual reactor hall, and you could do things with these buttons, and it affected things in the reactor hall. There was a phone ringing with pre-recorded messages. There were surveillance cameras with video footage of things that then took depended on what you did that could have different outcomes. And I thought it turned out really well. I am so bummed that very few people played it, but that's the problem with escape rooms. It doesn't scale, right? You can't have 2 million downloads the first day. So it's, but it was super fun and a good learning experience for doing electronics and other fun things. But that was just a side note. Yeah.
Financially profitable?
Not at all. It was terrible. Yeah, these things don't scale well. But we also didn't put that much money into it. It was mostly just our own time. I think we spent 4 or 5 months maybe building it and designing it. So yeah, but meanwhile, while doing that, I also started tinkering with ray tracing. And this was just before NVIDIA announced RTX with the hardware ray tracing. So since I was still using OpenGL, I couldn't really, even after they announced, I couldn't really access it because I didn't know Vulkan or the DirectX. So I was trying to do ray tracing and path tracing in screen space instead, which is not a great idea, but it sort of works for some scenes. It can actually give pretty nice results. And then started to look for ways how this could be used. And Emil also started toying with it a little bit to see is there anything we can build with this. And around that time, I got very fascinated by this little voxel modeling program called Magica Voxel. It's a free program that artists can use to create these beautiful images just by placing tiny voxels and then render them with a very good it's a very good light simulation, like very natural light, path traced. And around that time, a lot of these images came out on Twitter, and I followed a lot of artists. I thought they were beautiful, and I wanted to try and make something that looked like that. Like this combination of abstract, blocky geometry with this very natural lighting is such a nice clash. I was also playing a lot with Legos as a kid, so maybe that could be one reason. But I like the aesthetic. And then, as we talked about destruction and breaking things with triangles, after Smash Hit, I was kind of fed up with trying to break triangles. It's just not. Procedural breakage with triangles is just a big mess because of all the requirements from floating point precision, the convexity requirement for physics, and it's just terrible to work with. But with voxels, everything is discrete. If you could do collision detection on a voxel grid, that wouldn't need to be convex. You could, and if you could just render those voxels, everything would be solved. You could just like remove voxels and add voxels arbitrarily and have that all work. And you could do amazing destruction if you could just solve that problem. So I started to think about that and eventually just gradually implemented more and more ideas. And it seemed to work. So that was the beginning of this voxel engine that later became Teardown.
Okay, nice. And then, where did the name Tuxedo Labs came from?
Tuxedo Labs it's an old name actually. It's for we actually skipped over one part in history here that I could have some relevance. I know you've been on this podcast. I've been listening. You mentioned Telemetry by Rad Game Tools a couple of times.
Yeah.
And I'm actually the original author of that software.
Oh, really?
It was called, when I quit from Mekon, I started implementing a performance profiler for game engines because that was something I used. And as we talked about before, like trying to sell a problem, I noticed that a lot of game studios had problems measuring performance of their game engine. They had a lot of in-house profilers, and it was hard. Like, how should we visualize this? Multi-core computing started to pop up, and that made things actually really hard to visualize. So I wrote this profiler, and I called it dress code.
Okay.
I thought it was funny, like you dress the code with these little like things, and then you can just see beautiful graphs. Like this is how the program flows. Like this, these are the breakdown of each frame. And since the product was called Dress Code, I wanted a company name to be something related to that. So that's when I came up with Tuxedo Labs. And then just a few years later, I sold it to Rad, and they renamed it to Telemetry. I don't think it's a lot of code still survived from that, but the basic idea and the first version that they started working on was actually that software.
Okay.
So Tuxedo Labs was just a name I've been using since then.
Okay. I didn't know that. I should have known that. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's yeah. I still think it's a great idea. I've been using dress code personally all my projects since then, and there is an open source one now called Tracy that is also really good, but I find it a little bit overcomplicated. I think it's complicated to work with compared to this very simple. Everything you really want to know is to get like a timeline, and you want to be able to sort things on these zones and see how they interact. And I think dress code did that really well. It was a very it did only that, so it was easier to make that a smooth experience.
This was sampling
Yeah.
sampling profiler.
No, this was not a sampling profiler. It was you manually inserted these little tags in the functions you wanted to be included, because you don't want it to include everything.
Okay.
So you said like, this is the start of the frame. Here is where the rendering starts, and this is the computation. This is like the frustum calling.
Okay.
So that's where you had to dress your code with these little markups.
Okay. Okay. All right. So then you started work on Teardown, and you also had a team there, right?
Yes, I started. Well, I did. I guess when it started was with these experiments in screen space path tracing. Then Emil came on and started toying a little bit with that, and we did some prototypes. I switched over to the voxels, and we made prototypes for that. It was all a very frustrating experience because we didn't really get anywhere. We were doing this for 6 months, trying to come up with good gameplay, but we never really reached a point where it was. We never really found something that clicked, I think. So we stopped, and then I continued on my own for another 6 months until I came up with this two-phase heist structure for the game. So it was a very complicated, from a design perspective, it was super complicated to work with. And that was, I think, there were several reasons for it. One is that I'm not that great of a game designer, so I have to make a lot of trial and error to get something. I think I'm relatively good at seeing if it works or not, but actually coming up with the idea in the first place and then implementing it to find out, this also doesn't work, and then I have to stick with it. But also the promise was that we wanted a fully destructible world, not just like a window here and there. Like everything should be destructible, and we wanted to use it for gameplay, not just a visual. If you can destroy everything, it's gonna be gameplay. It's not just a visual effect. And it turned out to be very, very hard to design games around that because there aren't really any constraints. So I think that was also the reason it took so much time to come up with what the game should actually be.
Yeah. Maybe we should do an overview of Teardown, how it is right now, so that people watching and listening have the fair idea.
Right. So the gameplay that finally ended up being Teardown was that you well, there are a couple of different mission types, but the most common mission type is that you have a number of targets you want to steal at a map. The maps are relatively small, around 300-400 meters across. There are a number of targets, say 5, 6, 7 targets. They are connected to an alarm system, and when you take the first one, the alarm goes off, and you have to take the remaining ones, or as many as the remaining ones as you can. Some are required, some are optional, and reach an escape vehicle within 60 seconds. So it's not a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of preparation to reach that. And that's where the destruction comes into place. You can modify the level to your liking, and you have unlimited time to do this. You can use vehicles to crash into buildings, you can place stuff, you can reorganize, you can stack things, you can jump on. So you kind of speed run this thing in 60 seconds. The heist thing is basically just an excuse to build this speed running course where you can use a lot of physics and destruction.
And you have a lot of cool weapons to do that as well.
Yeah, the campaign progresses, you get more and more tools. You can put planks, and you have wires to connect things. You have different explosives and guns just to make destruction. Yeah, it's just a sandbox physics destruction game, but it has this objective of trying to accomplish something, which I think is what makes it work. A lot of people just play Teardown as a sandbox game, and there are dedicated sandbox modes where you have unlimited resources, of course. But I think, for me personally, I wouldn't play a game like that. I want some kind of motivation to do something. So I think it's important that you have this.
Yeah. It seems like from the physics standpoint, there is this destruction mechanics, but majority of the work was in the design, the worlds, levels, weapons. It feels like it's compared to your other games, like the mobile games like Smash Hit, this is like 90% physics and then like a nice rendering thing, and here as is the roles of flipped.
Yeah, there's definitely more content in Teardown. And it was, since I never had this desire to build a studio. I didn't want to build a team, and that doesn't come very natural to me. So I worked with contractors. It's developing Teardown was pretty messy because there were people coming and going a little bit. I used contractors for little bits and pieces, and it was I had to do a lot of management and just to make sure everyone's in sync. And I think in retrospect, Teardown turned out to be a little bigger than it maybe should have been for me as a coordinator, at least. Okay. So yeah, not as smooth as I would have hoped, but it turned out well in the end, I think.
Okay.
But it was not a smooth ride, definitely not.
So what is the state of Teardown now, and what are the plans for the future for the game?
So Teardown came out in early access in 2020. That's a long time ago now. And then we developed it further for a year and a half. So in 22, the 1.0 version was released. Shortly after that, I sold the company to Saber Interactive, or Embracer. Well, Saber was owned by Embracer, so it was the Swedish game a group of companies. Because I didn't have this, I don't like running companies. I don't want to build teams. I just want to program. So that was a way for me to keep Teardown going without having to take all the responsibility of employment and all of that. So Teardown had this amazing response also in the modding community, which I love. I think that's the coolest part about this game, that there are so many people sitting at home building things for this game, and they were scripting things in Lua, and then they publish it on Steam Workshop, and others try it, and with mediocre, when a game was released, we kind of just like, now it's done. Let's do something else. And then when we released the last one, like, that was it. Now we can do something else. But with Teardown, I felt like almost like a responsibility towards the modders. Like this has to keep going. So I didn't just want to abandon the project, even though, I felt that it deserved to to keep going. So I thought the best way forward was probably just to sell the company and have someone else manage all that, so I could focus more on the programming again.
Okay. Are you still involved in with Teardown team?
Not so much with Teardown anymore. I mean, I still help out here and there and answer questions, but it's what I work on is for an upcoming game.
Okay.
We haven't really decided what yet. Is this regular, for me, way of developing things, like starting with the technology, make something fun to play with, and then figure out what to do with it. So I'm at that stage. I'm just toying with stuff and see what's going to come out. And it is also voxel based. It's very similar to Teardown, but I try to make things right this time, like knowing, taking all the lessons learned from Teardown and make like a more proper voxel engine. So yeah, we'll see where it goes. It's gonna take some time, I think.
What are the lessons from Teardown?
There are a lot of them, actually, but it's also a lot of constraints. I think building things in Teardown is not as smooth as it should be. I mean, voxels, if you compare, building something in a game engine is generally pretty hard for a beginner. Like if you want to model, say you want to go open Unity and model your own room, like how would you do that? You would need like a 3D software. Maybe you have Blender, you set up vertices, you make a UV mapping, you have textures, and you need to learn all these concepts. Whereas with voxels, in theory, you would just place like Legos on top of each other. Anyone could do that. It's in theory, it's super simple. But in order to make it work, Teardown introduced a lot of restrictions. So just to fit in memory, all the voxels, they're just represented by 1 byte. So we have a palette. So you have a very restricted, limited number of colors you can use for anything. And you need to share this between the whole object. The way we render and simulate objects in Teardown also depends a lot on how much you want to minimize the amount of empty space in each shape. So if you build a whole room, you would have a lot of empty space in the middle of the room, like where there's nothing. So instead of doing it as one shape, what Teardown wants you to do is to break it up. So you make, say, each wall its separate shape that is filled with voxels, and then you have 4 shapes for all the walls, 1 shape for the floor, maybe 2 shapes for the roof, or 1 shape depending on how it looks. And all this, it makes it kind of complicated to work with. And there's also a restriction on the level size in Teardown, also from a technical limitation. So you cannot make anything larger than 400 meters across with the voxel resolution that we have, if you want shadows. So it's it's a lot of these. Also, when you model something, you cannot put voxels on a negative coordinate. So if you start modeling a table and you say like the center of the table is here, and then you build the table around that, and then you could figure out that, oh, I wanted a voxel actually on this end, but you already filled it up to 0, so you can't go to -1.
Okay.
And then you kind of have to offset everything, and that's going to shift the origo of that object, and going to affect how it's placed in the world. And it's just a lot of these that goes on and on. And I want to fix as much of that as possible to make it easy to build stuff with. But also, I switched out the whole rendering. I'm building a new physics engine for this to work more efficiently, to use the threads better with the graph coloring that we talked about, redoing joints completely. There's a lot of just doing things better on all fronts, basically.
Okay. So now you're doing that multi-threaded solver with the graph coloring. We didn't talk about deformable voxels and your idea, and we should talk about it. And also, I remember your blog post about hardware ray traced rendering style in Vulkan. So maybe we should touch on all those. The multi-threaded solver we've done, but let's talk about deformable voxels.
Yeah, maybe you start with the ray tracing, because I think it ties better together if we touch on how things are rendered first. So in Teardown, it was developed using OpenGL, so we didn't have access to the hardware ray tracing. There are a large number of tricks to make that work on OpenGL. So what we do, render each object as a box. And we do that using backface or front face culling. So you actually render the back side of each box. So at each fragment, we know the ray direction, and we know the size of the box. We can compute the intersection point of the ray and the front side of the box, and then we can kind of traverse through the data in that box. So that box represents a 3D grid filled with voxels, 1 byte each. 0 is no voxel, and then we have a palette for the rest ones, for the other ones. So we just traverse through the ray, along the ray, in this box until we hit something. But that can be used for putting the primary objects, the primary surface of the screen. But then when we want to do lighting, we can't really do that, because then when you want to throw a secondary ray in some direction, you just don't know where all the objects are anymore, because you rasterize the object onto the screen, but then you want to do lighting and you don't really have the objects, which is of course very, very troublesome. So what we did for Teardown, all the objects there is actually a dual representation. So there is a big voxel grid that represents if light is blocked or not. And this is for the whole world.
That's a lot.
The entire level is inside this shadow volume, as we call it, which is basically a big 3-dimensional bit field. So there is 1 bit for every voxel that determines whether light is blocked or not. So when doing secondary rays, we just step in this global axis-aligned voxel grid to see how far a ray is going. That obviously has a lot of limitations, like we cannot see the color of the surface it hits. We don't know if it's emissive. We don't know anything. Then we have to fall back to screen space to kind of fill in where it's possible. We can kind of fill in the details. But this has, as I said before, the limitation on level size, like 400 meters. That is because in OpenGL, you cannot have a 3D grid that is larger than 4096, or 2048 across. But since we have 8 bits per byte, we can actually squeeze 8 voxels per byte in that. So that turns out to be 4096 voxels across, and then our voxels are 10 centimeters. So that translates to 400 meters approximately. But yeah, there's a lot of tricks like this to make it work in OpenGL, and this is also something we wanted to get rid of. So I started to look into Vulkan to see if this could be done with hardware ray tracing instead. And so the idea, instead of rasterizing the primary, you just shoot rays in the world, and you still have these boxes with 3D textures, basically like 3D grids. But we throw all these objects into a BVH. We have this concept of TLAS and BLAS in hardware ray tracing, where you have a top level spatial hierarchy. So you can see which objects the ray actually hit, and you get like a little shader callback to make an intersection test. So I still traverse the voxel space, but now doing it in this form of hardware ray tracing, where the hardware can actually help doing this top level test, and then you get a little callback to see if it actually hits, and then you can return also the color information and everything, so you can actually have a more proper path tracing simulation. And it turned out to work really efficiently, even though hardware ray tracing was very much designed for triangles. And for this new engine, only use this bounding box test. But I've been amazed how efficient that actually is. And the way, because we're getting to deformables very soon, but the one of the limitations that we wanted to solve was the thing with the room. If you make a room with a lot of empty space, the reason you don't want to have that is, of course, that when the ray hits something and you want to traverse, it's going to take many, many steps to go through all the empty space in the room before it finally hits something. So with the new engine, we're breaking things up into chunks. So a voxel chunk is always 8 by 8 by 8 voxels.
Okay.
And then for each shape, it automatically creates and destroys these voxel chunks. You can have voxels in any shape or form, and it's just going to create these chunks where they are needed. And then these chunks are also going to go into the hardware ray tracing. So you do the callbacks that you get are per chunk. And then I started toying with the idea that maybe the shape of each chunk doesn't have to be a perfect cube or a box.
Okay.
Maybe you can deform the vertices of these to be like a skew box, or like a resized box. You can stretch it in different, you can stretch and skew. You can have like a general transformation for how this is deformed. So what you would do when the ray hits that skew box, you would transform the ray into the space, into the deformed space. So you could still do the stepping in a regular grid, and then you would have to transform back the result.
Okay.
So the idea was to be able to have like stretched and deformed chunks that make up this shape.
Okay.
But it was a lot of complicated math. Unfortunately, I'm not very good at math. I never been very comfortable with. I'm very comfortable implementing stuff and like thinking about numbers in a discrete way that suits computers and programming. But when it comes to actual math, it's continuous. It's just hard for me to think about derivatives and transforms and things like that. But I eventually found an approximation that works reasonably well. It's not an exact solution, and I think there might not even be an exact solution. I had a conversation with someone who's actually good at math, David Eberly, doing geometric tools. He claimed to have found a solution in one of his papers, and I tried it, but it didn't work. And then we had a long conversation where we came to the conclusion that maybe there doesn't exist a solution for this. but there is now at least a decent approximation to this that I think we can use. And we'll see. My plan is to try and use this for things like foliage, for trees, bushes, also for characters, deformable, having almost like a 3D voxel skinning, so to speak, so you can stretch and drag these voxels. But yeah, we'll see.
Okay.
We'll see where it goes.
Okay. The idea that you implemented something from a paper and then you contacted the author and then you had a chat and it's like, yeah, it might not work. It's a very interesting.
Yeah, I don't. It was very helpful, David Everly, in trying to help me with that. So I'm very thankful for that. But I think the general problem was not constrained enough for there to be an analytical solution to that. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see if the approximation works well or
Okay.
not.
Okay. I have a couple of open-ended questions. First of all, you spent a lot of time with physics, how it is today, and pushing the barrier forward. What do you think in the future in video games? What's possible in terms of like breakthroughs or milestones that we can hit in terms of physics in general?
I think physics, the golden age of physics in video games, as I see, was actually 20 years ago, when Half-Life 2 came out in, I think it was 2004, and then there were a number of games after that. Red Faction had really cool physics games, or this game where you could break things. Then it has not really disappeared, but it's I mean, the interest cooled off a little bit after that. And I think, and this is just my speculation, but I think one of the reasons is networking. That now, that's also around the time where online multiplayer got introduced in a lot of games, and getting physics to work with online multiplayer is really hard. So in many games, physics has just needed to take a step back. If you look at modern multiplayer games, there's very little physics going on that actually affects gameplay. There are some exceptions, of course, but in general, that's a hard problem to solve. And I think if that will be an area where I think there will be a lot of improvement going forward, trying to build massive physically simulated worlds and have that work well with networking. And the reason it's so hard with networking is because of latency. Until you have networks where latency is approaching the frame time,
Oh yeah.
it's going to be very hard to make a simulation, because when you have multiplayer games, there are basically two ways of doing synchronization. Either you use state synchronization, where you just send state of objects as fast as you can all the time, trying to keep them in sync, or you synchronize the inputs and have a deterministic simulation, and then you make a local prediction on each client, and then you compare that local prediction to the actual input when it arrives, and if there was a mismatch, if you did a misprediction, you're going to have to roll back the whole simulation to a state it was before and re-simulate it from that point with the correct inputs. And as you can imagine, doing this with a lot of physical simulation, it's not really an option. That's never going to work.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to either come up with some new paradigm doing synchronization, or we're going to rely on state synchronization. But if you have a lot of objects, state synchronization is going to require enormous amounts of bandwidth for those to work well. So I think the only solution that I see is hoping that network latency is going to be reduced to a point where we just don't have to do prediction. Whether that happens or not anytime soon, I don't know. Or if we can find other tricks to do some local prediction that doesn't necessarily involve re-simulating things. Because if you run a physics simulation that takes a substantial part of the frame time, and then want to do multiple of those when there is a misprediction, there's going to be a large stutter in frame rate. So I think something around that would be where I think there would need to be some kind of revolution for things to progress. But I'm also quite excited about character animation and physics and where that is going, especially combined with AI, machine learning, that is now so popular.
In what way?
And with that, sorry?
In what way? The character animation?
So I think, or I hope at least, that physics will be used a lot more for character animation now that we have a lot of compute power, good algorithms to simulate joints and how things that we can synthesize and simulate character animation rather than just relying on canned animation data.
Okay.
And then if you go a step in that direction, it's not that far-fetched to also involve AI or machine learning to have characters automatically balancing or moving, learning like a pattern in which they can move and then synthesize new motion depending on the circumstances. So if you have a character who wants to walk over a pile of rubble, that they can actually support themselves with their arms and have that all look very natural without necessarily doing all that with handcrafted or motion captured animations. But I don't know. It's some of that is already being done. Mostly just using AI directly working with the animation system. But I think there is a lot of benefits to it if you also involve simulation in that. We'll see. I'm not sure we're going to see that much more breakage. Maybe not. I think it depends on whether more games move to a volumetric representation, because the way objects are represented these days, or has always been, with you're basically just representing it by the surface. And if you just have the surface information, there isn't really a good way to break things, because you don't know what's on the inside and how that's going to work with texture coordinates and it's just a lot of it's really hard, and it integrates so deeply into the whole game engine. If you want to break something, you can spawn new objects, and it can affect gameplay and also from a game design perspective, that all these problems we had, like how do you design a game where you can break walls that you shouldn't be able to get through. And so I don't think breakage is going to be a big part of any game, at least not at that scale anytime soon. And maybe we don't even want that. I'm not sure. Yeah, so maybe something like that. And also physics engines have for a long time been focusing on performance rather than accuracy, I would say. I think there might be a development now that computers are so fast and the physics that people normally want are still pretty rudimentary. Like you want a couple of things moving, and for the most part, it's more important that they don't go through walls or they actually stack properly, rather than having the ability to stack 5,000 things on top of each other. I mean that. So I think maybe there will be some demand or movement towards a more accurate physics simulation. I think that would be welcomed by a lot of developers, at least.
Okay.
But yeah.
What about fluid simulation or cloth simulation in terms of the scope of the possible simulation? Because like we're doing, for example, fluid simulation with a fluid in a bowl, but what about like swimming in the ocean that is fully simulated, like, and you can see waves and you can like splash the water with your motion and all sorts of that.
Yeah, I think for cloth, we're almost already there, I would say. There is a lot of games simulating cloth, and there are good techniques for it. But for fluid, it's just, I mean, for 2D, I think for a 2D game, it's today pretty reasonable to simulate a large number of fluid. But if you compare 2D fluid, if you add that extra dimension, like that difference is almost like going from 0 to infinity. It's just so much more complicated to make a whole ocean of, say, particles. I don't think we're, at least not anytime soon, if ever, we're going to simulate that as physically. I don't really see that happening.
Okay. Do you play any games?
I do occasionally, but I wouldn't define myself as a gamer. I'm more interested in the technology and the development of games than actually playing them. I played a couple of games that I like recently, but it's not something I play maybe a couple of games a year, something like that.
What games did you play?
Most recently, I started playing Split Fiction. It was released just a couple of days ago. My daughter and I had a lot of fun playing It Takes Two. And we have been looking forward to Split Fiction. So yeah, we just started. We just played a couple of hours. I really like it. I enjoyed It Takes Two a lot. I think this co-op games is, to me, very underappreciated. I usually get pretty bored when I just play a single player game by myself. Multiplayer game online is too overwhelming for me. I just don't have it in me really to do it. But if you make it like a social activity to sit down with a friend and play a game where you actually help each other, or like where you do collaborate, that's a lot of fun, I think. So that's my main interest, I would say. But there are some single player games I've really enjoyed. Also, Inside, for instance, was a big favorite of mine a few years ago, and yeah, some more mainstream games I also enjoy. But now I'm not a big gamer, I wouldn't say.
When you play the games, do you always like look out for physics and physics bugs and then like wonder how it's implemented, or you're just detaching yourself and just...
I do study some games just for the physics sometimes, and it's a lot of fun, but it's a different experience. The games I enjoy are typically not using that much physics. I'm more interested in story-driven games and more adventure games. But
Have you
I don't
played
know if I have a good example.
Have you played Lego games? therefore two people
I
as
did.
well.
Yeah, I tried also playing that with my daughter. She was younger when we tried it, and I think she was maybe a bit too young to just cope with all the different inputs, and so we didn't have a good experience. I do think they are probably pretty good if you get into them, but we we never
Yeah.
got over that threshold.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're pretty physics based,
Yeah.
I
And
think, right?
it kind of faked physics, I think,
Okay.
mostly. But in terms of like platforming, there is a bit of
Mhm.
platforming usually done. But especially if you have like nostalgia for like Harry Potter or like specific thing, and
Right.
there's like a Lego game there, and just like two people on the couch playing, this is very like ideal experience for
Yeah.
to mix it up. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for the discussion. Can you please tell where people can follow you and your work?
Yeah, I'm the easiest place would be on X, where I'm Voxel Labs. I did start a Blue Sky account recently, but I didn't really try to move over to that yet. That will probably happen at some point. So for now, it's X and Voxel Labs.
Okay. Okay. And you have a cool blog.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Yeah, it's been going for a while now. I should write more on it. I do have a lot of things to write, I feel, but I never take the time to actually do it. So I should do that more. Thank you.
Okay. Dennis, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Now I will